And also this story, I mentioned this just briefly before the news. The French satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo has republished cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad that made them the target of a deadly terror attack in 2015. The republication comes ahead of 14 people going on trial accused of helping the two Islamist attackers carry out their gun attack, which killed 12 people in January 2015, a further 5 in related attacks that month. The front cover of the latest edition features the 12 original cartoons of the Prophet which were published in Charlie Hebdo. One of the cartoons shows the Prophet wearing a bomb instead of a turban, with the slogan, "All of that for this," written on it. Claire Fox is director of the Academy of Ideas, a champion, of course, of free speech and freedom of expression. Afternoon to you, Claire. It seems extraordinary. This was 5 years ago. This was one of the most shocking things I think most of us have seen, in the sense that it fed right into our values of freedom of speech and expression.
Yeah, I think that we were becoming familiar even at that time of the expression, "I find that offensive," as a way of shutting down debate and silencing people. We still hear it a lot today. But this was an example where satire, a very valuable tool in any democracy where you can lampoon and make fun of institutions, any institutions, including religious deities, including politicians and so on. A satirical magazine suffered the consequence of "I find that offensive" at the end of a brutal murder. I mean, it was the most shocking attack, because I think it brought to the fore the importance of defending the right to be offensive, the defense of being able to speak freely and irreverently. And we were all taken aback. We'd already experienced, and have sadly experienced subsequently, the nihilism and the damage caused by, and the deaths caused by ISIS and the jihadis around Islamism. And here we had an example that just really united the world. But sadly, it was only temporarily. You know, for a while, everyone said, "Je suis Charlie." And then people started saying, well, maybe not, you know. So that's a real shame. The greatest honor we could give those people would be to fight for free speech today.
And in terms of the knock-on effect, of course, nobody wanted to republish them. I remember at the time they were pixelated out on news programs. People were, I'm sure, on social media, which was still, obviously, it was around and doing its thing back then, but maybe not quite as amplified as it is today. But it did, you know, many would say, well, it kind of did the job, because people were fearful about what they said.
Well, actually, you're right. I mean, on the one hand, it wasn't just that people didn't republish. I mean, you could say that there was a certain chilling effect there, and there was a nervousness, and understandably, I think it's understandable that publications didn't want to jeopardize the lives of their staff by republishing, even though those who bravely did, one has to commend. But the broader chilling effect, I think, was when people started saying "Je suis Charlie," but, you know, and there has been some considerable serious rowing back where people have said, well, yes, but they were very offensive, those cartoons. They did upset people. I mean, maybe they brought it on themselves. You know, everybody says, oh, I'm not justifying the murder. But on the other hand, we shouldn't offend people gratuitously. And once you start doing that, that huge but on free speech, you actually are right to say that maybe they did have the impact of, you know, silencing people, making them more frightened and more wary. And rather than us sticking by those values you spoke about, Ian, so important values for our lives in a free society, people started to say, well, maybe those values need to be re-looked at. And if you look at where we're at now in 2020, I think we can safely say that free speech is in a much worse position today than it's ever been. We're under assault. Those of us who say that we support free speech are often accused of being, you know, far right, you know, simply wanting free speech so that we can be racist and gratuitously offensive and so on. So I really commend the magazine editors of today for honouring their comrades who were killed, and also honouring that value of free speech by republishing. I mean, that's a brave thing to do. And in a period where actually bravery is not something we associate with politics anymore. I mean, everybody's kind of rowing back and running away and in retreat. I am just really gratified that they've done this. It's a real inspiration.
On the wider issue then, Claire, of free speech, and, you know, I've mentioned this to you before, and you're in a way a great example. Anyone who knows your backstory, your kind of area of politics and interest, will understand and know fully sort of more or less what you stand for on quite a lot of issues. But then, of course, you had the audacity, the absolute cheek, and I can't believe you'd even go out in public to vote to leave the EU, and you took it to the level of becoming an MEP for the Brexit Party, and that was it. You were, as far as some people can, you were person non grata. You were one of the right-wing, rabid extremists as a result of this. You know, you're a great example of how the crass and sometimes dangerous polarity, or a symbol of how that crass and dangerous polarity can flare up in the most, you know, previously unimaginable ways.
Well, certainly there's been lots of attempts at cancelling me, but let's be honest, I'm on your show.
Yeah,
I've just been given a peerage. I mean, I can't exactly claim that I don't get a voice, right? But I think that the most important thing was that when people attacked me for standing for the Brexit Party, for example, or tried to write me off as, you know, every day there will be somebody who says that I'm a fascist apologist, mentions Hitler because I supported Brexit. I mean, you can't really make it up, but yeah. And so it goes on. But what they were really doing was they were attacking the public, weren't they? And what I was most in distress about, in fact, the reason I stood as a Brexit Party candidate, was because ordinary people who don't get the chance to come on talk radio necessarily, or do media or have a platform like I have, they were being traduced. I mean, they were basically being delegitimized, you know, cancelled before it was fashionable to say cancel culture, were people who simply voted in a referendum perfectly legitimately and were then told that they were ignorant, backward, racist knuckle draggers who didn't understand anything. And I felt myself that if in a democracy we allowed that to happen, that democratic free speech, I mean, free speech, you can't get more free speech than just voting something and saying you voted a particular way. And for then to people to have the audacity to turn around and say, you can't say that, you can't vote that way, that really would be where you'd say the jihadists won. You know, we've been talking about Charlie Hebdo. What they say is death to the West. You know, we you know, it's nihilistic. Every value that emerged from the Enlightenment, like free speech and democracy, we want to destroy and physically eradicate. So what we should never do, but sadly we have been doing, is to actually ourselves start dismantling the symbols of freedom. And as far as I'm concerned, the nihilism associated with the brutality of that slaughter in Paris around Charlie Hebdo is sadly reflected in some of the ways that we've seen cancel culture being acted much more at home by people in our own country who have the nerve to basically say that the liberties that were fought for by our forefathers should be cancelled now because they represent white privilege, or they represent, you know, colonial past, or what have you. This is lacking in nuance and equally as nihilistic. I worry about where we stand, but that's why I think it's very important that we never forget Charlie Hebdo. I mean, we said je suis Charlie. Somebody wrote earlier, toujours Charlie, and that's it forever. We must not forget Charlie Hebdo and what happened there, and we should commend the bravery of their colleagues today. But we ourselves need to recognise that there are, I use the phrase, there are people at home, enemies within, I was going to say, but you know, there are that nihilistic anti-freedom forces in our midst today, and we have to be very wary of them in order to honour those people who were killed in the Charlie Hebdo massacre.
Indeed. Claire, always good to have you on. Thank you. Claire Fox, Director of the Academy of Ideas, with us here on Talk Radio. And it was a particularly graphic and grisly, murderous, barbaric episode in Paris when that happened. And we know that any terrorist attack is, by definition. There was something about the entire, I guess, the symbolism of a free press, because it went directly to the issue of a free press. It was such a an amplified and a graphic example of a clash of ideologies. There's a free press. It's a satire magazine. It pokes fun at politicians, at politics, at high-profile figures, institutions, and religions. That's what it does. And a group of gunmen came along and tried to blow that away. So it was incredibly and murderously totemic in the way that it threw up the mother of all polarized debates about the kind of world you want to live in, that one or this one. But of course, as Claire said, there was the Je suis Charlie but that kind of tagged on after, well, there are caveats to what you can say. And there shouldn't be, as long as you're not inciting violence or racial hatred. To have a pop at a religion should be the fundamental backbone of free speech. It should be taught to children in schools, for goodness sake, that this is a great example of where free speech can find its path and its life form in criticising, lampooning, cartooning, satirising, dramatising religion. And whether that happens to be the Charlie Hebdo magazine cover, whether it happens to be Monty Python in Life of Brian, or myriad comedians who will stand up on a weekly basis in their routines and poke fun at men in dresses who stand in altars conducting weddings, people who wear funny hats and do crazy things, folk who decide you've got to grow your hair one way or another in order to show you're elite, whatever it happens to be. If you want to have a pop at that religion, you should almost be encouraged to at least acknowledge your freedom to do that. Whether you want to do it is another issue. But the day that we remove that particular plank, and of course everybody got really itchy about this, and I know that there are other narratives and considerations afoot here. When I think about, a civilized society, you don't want that to lead into some kind of racism. You don't want it to be seen as a green light. Oh, I can have a pop then at these people. In that case, I can do all manner of things. I can graffiti a wall in Bethnal Green if I fancy with some terror. No, that isn't what it's about. Free speech comes with a certain intelligent roadmap, if you like, and a set of obvious principles. I.e., don't harm people, don't in any way try and incite something. That should be a given. But the idea that clash did have, Charlie Hebdo story did have a kind of an effect, because still to this day, if you make some kind of satirical point, and it's about a certain faith, then you will pay a price. If I could say something about, Scientologists on the radio, I guarantee the Scientology people, if you've seen any of those documentaries, the Louis Theroux one, and there's been a couple of others, if you ever seen any of that stuff, you'll know these people get very, very upset. If I were to do, of course, doing comedy